So we're now going to move on to our penultimate speaker, who is Kathryn King from Sported. I know we have a number of sports organisations that are on the call, on the conference, and Sported, I cheer a cricket club and we're a member of Sported, so I know them well. They are a body that has supported grassroots community sports organisations for some time in creating network opportunities, learning, sharing knowledge, insights, funding programs. They do a huge amount to connect grassroots organisations, volunteers and the like. So we're delighted to hear some thoughts from Kathryn as they grapple with the challenge of, how all of that is going to restart and probably their own little bungee around what they're going to keep and not keep and whatnot. So I'm now going to hand over to Kathryn and look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Lovely, thanks very much, Paul. Hi everyone, really delighted to be here speaking to you today. Just going to get some slides up. Can you see my slides? Yes, brilliant. Okay, fantastic. So I just wanted to I guess, set the scene a little bit in terms of who we are, just to give a little bit more background. So I think, as Paul said, our members, as we call them, are small voluntary-led organisations in the main. They are your traditional sports group, but they're also community organisations, CICs, youth groups, so all types of organisations who are really focusing on how they use sport to benefit young people, and that's across the whole of the UK. Our members deliver over 90 different types of sports and physical activities. Many of them I haven't even heard of and I don't really know what they are. But what is really important is the impact that COVID has had on these groups. So that's both from the fact that they're volunteers themselves and what we've learned throughout this period, but also the volunteers who work and support us to support these groups. So what we do in terms of trying to help these organisations is we have an amazing skilled volunteer team, and these people use their business skills to really help our member organisations to develop the back end stuff, the strategic issues, the operational challenges they may have, because they're amazing at delivering the sport. But our volunteers help them to deliver that side. And what we've definitely learned is that support and that ability to think about planning and what do we do next has been really prevalent as we've gone through throwing in a pandemic over the past year or so. So what did we do? So when this hit, we suddenly realised that we needed to, more than we've ever done before, and one thing we've probably been a little bit guilty of is not hearing enough from our groups around what they actually need from us. We heard word of mouth, we heard ad hoc, but we maybe didn't guiltily actually ask them enough exactly what they needed. So we put together something called the Community Pulse. And like lots of organisations, we went out there and we ran some surveys, and there's definitely been a challenge, I think, within the sector around not over surveying groups to feel like they're just being bombarded with trying to find out how they were. But we ran 3 surveys over the past year, and a more recent one we've just done as well, and also held 3 focus groups just to try and get some more detail from our groups on how they were really feeling. We were delighted to get a really great response from our membership, and what it did is it also gave us a really good excuse just to get on the phone. And a lot of people just said to us, we just really appreciated you picking up the phone, just to give some moral support, even if it wasn't to go through all of the questions. It was a really good excuse to pick up the phone and talk to people, as we knew we all felt a bit isolated and disconnected. So we knew that people in communities running groups, feeling a huge burden of responsibility for other volunteers, facilities, young people, communities, those young people's families, suddenly had a whole heap of stuff thrown at them in terms of, well, what do we do next? How do we continue to support our young people? So just being able to feel like we were doing something by getting on the phone was also really important for us to feel like we were being really valid and needed. What we've then been able to do with the data is to change how we react to things. And I think that we would definitely also recognise that in the past we've potentially not been the most flexible organisation, not always being able to react to need. And we've actually realised in ourselves that we can change things quickly, we can be flexible. The whole Sported team have been brilliant, all obviously working from home, based all over the UK. Been really flexible in terms of how we've been able to change what we do and really listen to what our members have needed throughout this period. And for us, the other benefits have been we formed some new partnerships. We also were very lucky to be one of the charities who was the Times Charity of the Year at Christmas, and got a lot of money in from that, which helped our own sustainability. But as a result of that, we've been able to do more to help our groups, particularly thinking about some of the emergency grant funding that we've been able to give to them, because funding, fundraising, concerns about money have definitely been one of the major things that we have seen as we've gone through this process. So what we did find as we went through, just some key findings. There's lots of other things that we've learned as well. You know, some of the chat's been around the experience of, you know, young people with disabilities as well, feeling more isolated as well throughout this process. We've learned a lot more, but I've just picked out some of the key things to share today, and also particularly focusing on what we've learned around anxiety and mental health challenges. But we really found that there were sort of 3 initial key phases, and then obviously the phase that we're in now, where there's still a lot of uncertainty. We're still all aiming for different dates in terms of hoping when things will slowly even more get back to normal. But what we have seen as a real key constant throughout this period of time is anxiety, and that's around the mental health and the physical health of group leaders themselves, as well as their young people. And there's also been very high anxiety levels, particularly in the beginning, where we found that 1 in 4 of our groups were actually concerned they wouldn't still exist in 6 months' time. So that's a huge burden for people to be carrying on top of their own personal challenges, as well as they've gone through this period of time. We did find as we progressed that anxiety did slowly begin to drop a little bit, but it's been very up and down with the in lockdown, out of lockdown, you can do this, you can't do this again. So it's been a real roller coaster, I think, for people in terms of thinking about, well, this is what we can do next. Oh no, we can't do that next now. And just a whole raft of different challenges that were thrown at them. And I think as we got towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year, there was again a real ramping up, I think, about the concern of the mental health of young people coming out of this pandemic, the loneliness and the isolation, the lack of being able to get out and do things, the lack of being able to access technology by some young people and being able to stay involved and connected. So there's been a real constant challenge and concern from people around that as we've gone through this period of time. So I've just picked out some of the key areas that our groups have really told us that they've worried about. You know, if we track right back, most things stopped, didn't they? So most groups had to stop what they were doing. They had to close buildings, close facilities, stop all sports activities. And what we did find during that period, I think, as a lot of the other speakers have touched on today and a lot of the chats touched on, is the resilience and the ability for people and communities to pull together and to really think about, well, what else can we do? If we can't do what we do normally, what else can we do? There's been an amazing number of groups operating food banks, collecting shopping and prescriptions and things, and delivering that to vulnerable people. So really just thinking about, we are the centre of our community. How can we pull together and keep things going and keep supporting people? We also found that some of those groups who before we may have considered to be the more thriving organisations, they had a facility, they employed staff. suddenly they were the ones who had more of the concerns maybe than some of those who were just voluntary organisations with furloughing. How do we still pay the cost of bills? Our insurance is up for renewal. What do we do about that? We haven't got the subscriptions coming in on a weekly basis. So there have been all of these different concerns that people have had to deal with throughout this period of time. And the future has definitely been something in the back of people's minds. I remember at the start of the pandemic myself, I watched the news every day just to find out what was going to happen next, and then nothing changed, so you didn't want to watch it anymore. And I think that's been a sort of a constant thing for many other people, is just you want to hear what's happening next, but actually there was no good news. So people were struggling about how to plan and how to move forward. Unsurprisingly, 62% of the groups identified emergency funding and fundraising support as something that they needed immediately, as massive challenges for costs, etc., mounted up. And technology began to very quickly become a challenge for many groups in terms of how can we stay connected with our young people, not having the skills to be able to operate things like Zoom that they'd never used before in their lives, but also then the challenge of young people not being able to access the hardware and the technology. You know, hearing stories of households where 3 young people were trying to access mum's mobile phone just to do their schoolwork. How would you then prioritise a young person trying to get involved in a Zoom session to stay involved in their group's activities? So many different worries and concerns that people have had throughout this period of time. So anxiety is another big one that's obviously we've talked about a lot today already, and we did actually find that the anxiety of our group leaders was actually higher than the national average of anxiety, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, when everything hit and nobody knew what was going on. We also found that groups who operated in levels where there were higher levels of deprivation also were more anxious about participants and more anxious about the future of their organisation than maybe groups in areas where there were slightly less challenges. A positive is when we got to April this year, there were more groups who were confident that their organisation was still going to exist. What we don't know yet is obviously the fallout of how many groups don't exist anymore because of the challenges of the pandemic. And I think that will take a while to actually realise the impact in some communities in terms of groups who just haven't been able to reopen for many different reasons. So that's something that we want to continue to find out from our organisations and to support them with. So while we've seen anxiety levels have dropped, what we're now seeing is, I guess, also some of that social anxiety for people going out again. You know, we've talked about people shielding and how strange it must be to have been trapped in a house and then go out again. But I think a lot of us can probably identify that with that to some extent. I went into London for the first time this week, and I was not looking forward to getting on a train and seeing what it was going to be like, having just been in my own bubble at home. So I think there's a lot of people who have been longing for normality, but actually there is now also that fear around going out and doing things again. So that's definitely another challenge, is how do you now get those young people back? Some have flooded in and were really keen to get going, but there's also a lot of anxiety, I think, amongst staff as well as participants about going back and starting activity once again. So as we have reopened, what we've looked to do is we asked our groups how many of you are back in business, so to speak. And there's a good number, there's a good percentage of groups who are back and reopening. And within that, there's different challenges, again, that many are experiencing. So some who perhaps operate in indoor facilities are experiencing more of a challenge with the social distancing regulations that there still are. Or some groups have told us that the facility that they use is a vaccination centre now, so they can't get into their facility to reopen, and there's so many more restrictions, or potentially prices have gone up. So there are ongoing challenges in terms of trying to reopen, particularly for some groups more than others. We've also seen a lot of groups adapting in so many different ways, and I touched on it earlier with just that community spirit. I think has just been incredible. You know, we've heard other stories about groups who have got on a bicycle with some jigsaw puzzles and some board games in the basket at the front, and literally ridden around different parts of London, just dropping off things to families to keep them engaged during this period of time, and looking at how to strengthen that family bond and keep people going, particularly, you know, in areas where there isn't that access to outdoor space as well. What more could those groups do to keep those families going? Again, thinking about virtual delivery, we've definitely also seen the digital divide has grown in terms of groups who are really savvy at using and accessing technology. We're just launching a new online area for our members, but within that, we understand there will be people who will still struggle to access that for many different reasons. So one of the things we're looking at as we move forward is how can we support groups with that digital divide? How much of it is skill-based? How much of it is around actually access to the hardware to be able to use technology to help them more? And I think, like in the chat, we've touched on around you go to conferences, but actually being able to access it virtually is really good as well. I think there will be some groups who, even when things are more normal, will continue to have some kind of a virtual presence because they can engage some young people they may not have reached before as well. So there's a definite need to look at some of those challenges around digital as we move forward. So what have we done throughout this time period? Well, as I touched on at the beginning, I think we've learned a lot, and as we've just heard with Mariah's wonderful poem, it's about reflecting and looking in the mirror. And I think we've reflected and looked in the mirror at ourselves a little bit in terms of thinking about, well, how do we need to react differently as an organisation? We're here to support our groups, our members, so we need to better understand what they need from us, and that's something we will continue to do as we move forward. Now, is in that respect, it's been a great learning curve for us, but we definitely learned around just reaching out, increased communications, more information about money is always going to be good, so that's something that we're continuing to look at. We have secured some funding. Some of the money we used from the Times Christmas appeal, we're delivering a mental health project, really looking at supporting organisations to support their young people. You know, we don't know how long it will be till we know the true extent of the challenges of mental health. So what we want to do is make sure that we support our groups to be able to support their young people. And we also introduced a leadership coaching program for our group leaders, very much more focusing on them. How are they doing and how can they support them as well as their organisation? So we've definitely changed some of our delivery in terms of giving more of a moral support and focusing more on the actual needs of our groups. And that's something that, as I said, we'll continue to do moving forward as I guess we see more of a fallout of what is going to happen next as we move out of COVID-19. So that's the end of my presentation. Just a bit of a whistle-stop tour, I guess, in terms of what we've done, what we've learned, what we've heard from our groups, and how we're going to do things differently as we move forward and continue to focus and learn from communities, because that is where the strength and the really good stuff has come from over this past year and a bit of crazy times.